Pray with me, please. Be with us this morning, God. Quiet our hearts. May our spirits be still, that we might hear from you. Amen. When we pick up with today's gospel lesson from Mark, Jesus has already had a long day. He's already traveled all across Galilee, ultimately landing in Capernaum. And he has there preached in the synagogue and cast out an unclean spirit and dealt with countless questions about who he is and what he's up to, and all of this, and it's barely even lunchtime. All of this has already happened when we pick up in today's passage. So now, as this passage picks up, we see him leave this synagogue in Capernaum and go to Simon Peter's mother-in-law's house, where he's been told the woman is sick, and he's been asked to heal her, which we see him do. And no sooner has he done that than word begins to spread about where he is now, and thus those same crowds who'd been hounding him at the synagogue now suddenly show up at Peter's mother-in-law's house, all of them clamoring to be touched by him, or to be healed by him, or to be counseled by him, or at least in some way to be consoled by him. So by late evening, the text tells us, the whole city had shown up looking for him. The whole city, the text tells us. Now let's pause right here for just a second to make sure we're absorbed enough in this story to recognize what's been happening, to recognize the toll that all of this has no doubt been taking on Jesus. Again, the whole city has come out to him wanting something from him. And according to the text, all day long he has patiently listened to these people and healed these people and comforted these people and encouraged these people. And then, according to the text, this continues on for the rest of the night. Which means, if we are at all discerning readers, that by the time Jesus finally breaks away from these crowds, he is spent. And what's more, he knows it's all about to happen again tomorrow. And then again the next day. And then again the next day, and on and on and on. For the word is now out. This is a man who helps people. This is a man who gives of himself without remainder. This is a man you need to go and see. You see, once that kind of reputation sticks, that reputation spreads. Right, Paul? And Jesus no doubt knows this. And so given this reality, given this state of affairs, Jesus spent and exhausted, and knowing that another day like this one is coming again tomorrow, given that, what do we see him in this text now do? Now, before we answer that, let's step outside of this narrative for just a moment. Let's step outside of this text for just a moment. Let's take a quick moment to reflect on our own lives and on our own culture and on our own practices. We live in a pretty fast-paced world. We live in a world where much is daily demanded of us, right? And not only that, we live in a world where there's an expectation that we will meet all of those demands, that no matter what those demands are, that it is our responsibility that they be met. And so we strive day in and day out to meet them. Doesn't matter what we do from a professional standpoint, the fact remains true for all of us. We are constantly being pulled in different directions, constantly expected to get this done and get that done. Constantly expected to make sure that this gets taken care of and that that receives proper attention. Meanwhile, underneath all of these responsibilities, all of these expectations, there's often a lurking pressure that if we don't somehow get it all handled, and if we don't somehow keep it all together all the while, then somehow we're not enough. That somehow we're a failure. That somehow we're unworthy. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so good. Let's bracket that, and now let's go back to this text from Mark. Now remember, in this text we see Jesus spend His entire day teaching and preaching and healing and listening and giving. That's what we see happen here in this passage. A day fully devoted to service. Now, if we were to read further, if we're to go on beyond this passage, if we're to extend through verse 45, we see Him repeat the same thing the next day. In these verses, we see Jesus leave Capernaum and go do these same things in yet another town. Thus, the entire arc of what's happening in Mark chapter 1 is the story of Jesus doing amazing things, of Jesus pouring Himself into others, of Jesus pouring Himself into His work, of Jesus pouring Himself into His life's calling. And let it not go unsaid, if you read Mark 1, it is a chapter full of amazing, colorful scenes, demons leaving bodies, mother-in-laws being healed, entire cities in hot pursuit of one highly charismatic man. It's compelling. But here's the thing about this story we discussed today. Here's the thing about reading this particular passage. Because of how colorful and how compelling these scenes are, we often miss the very brief narrative interlude that Mark includes in verses 35 and 36. Because of how much more thrilling the scenes are before it and after it, we often overlook the seemingly innocuous detail that Mark sandwiches right there in between these colorful stories. And so because we so often do read past that, I want us this morning to listen to those verses together. And as we do, I want us to remember that this passage comes right after Jesus' first day of teaching and preaching and healing and listening and giving, and comes right before Jesus' next day of teaching and preaching and healing and listening and giving. Right between them. And so now I quote Mark chapter 1, verses 35 through 36. That morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there He prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for Him, but they could not find Him. Now this might seem like a mundane detail tucked away within this hugely colorful narrative. But if you ask me, it's one of the most important details in the whole story. Because here we see Jesus spent from giving all that He had yesterday and knowing that this same thing is what will be required of Him again today. We see Him now, instead of just getting on with it, instead of just heading on to the next town and doing it all over again because that's His job, here now we see Him instead withdraw to a place all by Himself. We see Him, as the text says, withdraw out to a deserted place. And there we see Him take time to simply rest and to reflect and to pray and to exhale and to just be. Leading me to a question. How often do you allow yourself to just be? How often do you grant yourself permission to just rest, or just reflect, or just pray, or just exhale? I'm willing to bet not very often. I'm willing to bet that because we live in a culture where this kind of thing is not only tacitly discouraged, but is more often than not overtly criticized. If you aren't working, you aren't living. If you aren't producing, you're not contributing. If you ain't first, you're last. Any opportunity to quote Ricky Bobby from the pulpit, I take it. We giggle and we laugh, but we also nod because we know it's true. We know that despite the fact that we all feel worn down at times, and exhausted at times, and simply overwhelmed at times, we know that despite that, we still feel that quiet, steady, relentless pressure to keep giving, to keep going, to keep pushing, to keep on. Whatever it is in our lives, we feel the pressure to never let up on it an inch. Am I right? Then hear me say this now. This is insanity. By which I mean it's literally insane. I say that because insane literally means, deriving from the Latin root sanus, to be outside of health, out of proper biological health alignment. But the point I want to make this morning is about so much more than simply our biology, for it's not only a brute fact that, biologically speaking, our bodies need rest, that they necessarily have to have rest and care and rejuvenation, but it's also a brute fact that our spiritual nature needs it and that our spiritual health depends on it as well. Leading me to a quick word on Christian theology. Traditional Christian theology holds that A, God Himself intentionally rested after having magnificently given of Himself in the act of creation. And moreover, that B, Jesus Christ is in fact that same God in human form. And so, by that measure, what we see Jesus do, we Christians hold, is a picture of what God wants humanity to do, of what God created humanity to do, and thus of what God expects humanity to be. Thus, when we see in the first chapter of Mark's Gospel that God become human after having faithfully attended to His affairs, then needed and took rest, we should, from a traditional theological view, take this to mean that this is the norm for humanity. That after fully giving of ourselves, we are supposed to feel depleted. And thus, that we should not feel the need to apologize for feeling this way. But what's more, and go with me here because this is the crucial point, what's more, not only do we see that God become human needed rest, but here we see Himself give Himself permission to take it. Meaning this: if what we see Jesus do in the Gospels, by I mean all we see Jesus do in the Gospels, is in fact a glimpse at what God looks like operating under human conditions. And again, this is what we traditionally claim as Christians. If so, then that means that carving out intentional periods for rest and reflection and prayer and rejuvenation is a spiritual practice, a spiritual necessity, part of our sanus, part of our biological and spiritual health, part of what makes us fully sane, part of what makes us fully human. Bringing me now to my point. We might not spend our days teaching and preaching and healing and listening and giving like Jesus. We might not spend our days traveling the dusty back roads of Galilee and having entire cities flock to us for our help. But we do, like Jesus, daily give of ourselves. All day, every day, in one way or another, we give of ourselves. And just like with Jesus, this giving of ourselves can be exhausting. It can tire us. It can overwhelm us. And if it goes unchecked, it can start feeling to us like a tremendous burden. And that is why these two verses in this passage of Mark's Gospel are so important. Because if we have ears to hear, us that like Jesus, we too can give ourselves permission to take time out of the never-ending demands placed on us so as to carve out periods of intentional rest. These two little verses show us that like Jesus, we too can go out to a deserted place and that there by ourselves and before God, we can practice the discipline of replenishing ourselves, of taking care of ourselves, of resting, of simply allowing ourselves to be. I trust you're following me. And so the question I then put before each of us today is this: what are the deserted places you can go? Where are the places you can withdraw to so as to grant yourself rest? Is it your garden? Is it to a pond or a lake or a river? Is it a coffee shop or a golf course? Is it to the woods or to the weight room or to the workroom or the workshop? Where's the place that you know that you can go to recharge and to reflect and to be replenished and to just for a period of time be? Let me be clear about what I'm asking and what I'm referring to here. I'm not talking about losing ourselves in our cell phones or in our computers or in our television or any other type of distraction like that. I'm not saying take time away from our responsibilities for these things, because that's not taking time for rest. That's seeking escapism. That's not really cultivating reflection. In fact, that's actually a way, if we're not on guard, to begin developing an addiction. Now, what I'm talking about includes intentionally unplugging from those kinds of things for a while. What I'm talking about is carving out a specified time and a specified place where we're not laboring and where we're not also being distracted, so that we can be fully present. Present to God, present to the moment, present to our surroundings, present to ourselves. What I'm talking about doing is doing what Jesus did, which is amid the unyielding demands on His time and His energy, deliberately stepping outside of it all for just a moment and humbly coming before God so as to experience rest and replenishment. We can do that. We can do that. But that's not the point of the sermon. The point of this sermon is this: we must do that. We must do that because we are by very definition insane not to do it. And so then I conclude today by asking you this: what will it take to make this a weekly discipline in your own life? What can you do to ensure that this will happen in your own life? And where can you go to make this happen? These are the things I challenge you to think about as we leave today. We today sit at the pivot point between spring and summer. So let us covenant together to practice this discipline this summer season. Let us covenant together this summer to try to be a little more like Jesus in this way. Let us covenant together this summer to worship God by looking after our own physical and spiritual health in this way. Let us covenant together this summer to, whenever the energy within us has been drained, let us covenant together this summer to go out to a deserted place and pray. Let us covenant together this summer to go out to a deserted place and there before God and there with God, just simply be. Amen.